Everything seemed cut from soft black velvet, or gold, or orange velvet. Smoke panted out of 1,000 chimneys like the plumes of funeral parades. From kitchen windows drifted 2 pumpkin smells, gourds being cut, pies being baked. Anyone could see that the wind was a special wind this night, and the darkness took on a special feel because it was All Hallows Eve. This is Carolina Haints. Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Halloween has always had an element of mischief about it. It is trick or treat, after all. We've all seen Halloween pranks that range from harmless to rather intense. And in this age of desensitized values and outrageous TikTok challenges, it's pretty easy to imagine that Halloween pranks have only gotten more and more extreme through the years. But you'd be wrong. A 150 years ago, there was no candy in Halloween. No treats, only tricks. And they had gotten so out of hand that officials tried to have it completely banned. In the late 1800s, kids would pour black paint on unsuspecting travelers, throw bricks through shop windows, or scrawl obscenities on walls. Pipe bombs had even become a common occurrence. In 1902, officials in Illinois issued a statement.
Most everybody enjoys a joke or fun to a proper degree on suitable occasions. But when property is damaged or destroyed, it is time to call a halt. We would advise the public to load their muskets or cannons with rocks, salt, or birdshot, and when trespassers invade your premises at unseemly hours upon mischief bent, pepper them good and proper so they will be effectively cured and have no further taste for such tricks.
However, some people simply left their guns loaded with buckshot, and several kids, as young as 11 or 12, were shot to death. These hijinks grew bigger than a group of 4 or 5 neighborhood buddies. They were often well-orchestrated mobs. One train conductor slid his engine to a stop when he spotted a body laying on the tracks. He jumped out to check on the person's condition, only to find that it wasn't a person at all, but a mannequin. Suddenly, a group of 200 teens rushed the train, terrorizing its passengers. In Toronto, a group of teenagers decided to build a bonfire in the middle of the city. Fueled by gasoline and chunks of fencing and sign, the fire grew larger and larger, as did the participants. When the police arrived, the mob refused to run away. They stood their ground, pelting the officers and their horses with rocks. They erected barricades to prevent the fire trucks from getting in to help. When the police finally broke through, they arrested a dozen or so kids who were deemed the ringleaders, expecting that to disperse the mob. It didn't. The remaining group, now 7,000 strong, marched toward the police station, intent on setting them free. It took tear gas and water cannons to ultimately deter the rioters. So now you see why a ban has been proposed on Halloween several times, as late as 1962. Ultimately, starting in the 50s, a campaign was started to target Halloween to a younger audience. It wasn't until after World War II that candy was introduced as the treat of choice for Halloweeners. But that doesn't mean that Halloween is safe today or that pranks still don't go a bit too far. In 2011, a few people were gathered at Liddell People's house for a Halloween party. One woman, Maria Adams, thought it would be funny to hide people's bag of Skittles from him. He didn't think it was funny. The two argued, and things quickly escalated into a scuffle. At some point, Maria threw a dinner plate at Liddell's face, scratching him over the eye. Peoples retaliated by turning her into a human pincushion, using several steak knives. He then calmly called the police and told them what he had done. Happy Halloween. In 2015, a Nebraska man set up what he thought was the perfect Halloween prank. He put some fake blood on an old apron and hid in the bushes with a chainsaw. A fully functional, unmodified chainsaw, with the blade still on. But that's not what got him in trouble. He hid in the bushes waiting for the first group of kids. He didn't have to wait long. He jumped out, started up the chainsaw, and waved it around like a maniac. As expected, the kids screamed and ran away. The man chuckled, quite pleased with himself, and hid back in the bushes. It went pretty much the same way with the next group of kids, and by the time the third group of kids came along, the man jumped out and waved the chainsaw around. Once again, the kids ran away, but one little girl ran the wrong direction, more concerned with the madman behind her than where she was running. She ran right into the path of a passing truck and was rolled under the vehicle. Now let's back things up a few decades. In 1974, 8-year-old Ronald O'Brien was spending the late night hours of Halloween gorging on his trick-or-treat candy with his sister. His dad finally told him that it was almost time for bed and they could only have one more piece for the night. Ronald chose a packet of pixie sticks, one of his favorites growing up. An hour later, Ronald was dead. His dad had checked their candy as best he could and discarded apples in case they had razor blades in them. But there was no way anyone could tell that pixie sticks had been laced with cyanide. Ronald's dad, Timothy, was a deacon in the local church and an esteemed optician in the community. Earlier that evening, he had taken his 2 children trick-or-treating with 3 other neighborhood kids. They visited one house where no one would answer the door. The children grew impatient and ran ahead to the next house. Timothy caught up to them and said the homeowner finally answered the door and handed them each a pixie stick. Ronald was the only kid who ate his pixie stick that night. It was obvious to the authorities that the pixie stick was to blame. They went around to the other houses and 3 of the missing 4 sticks were recovered. The parents of the 5th child were hysterical. They couldn't find the pixie stick in the bag of candy. They rushed upstairs to find the boy unresponsive in his bed. But, thankfully, he was just asleep, with the missing pixie sticks too clutched in his hand. He hadn't been able to tear it open. Analysis showed that the candy had enough poison in it to kill about 4 adults. The next few days, as the police investigated, the community was in a panic. Numerous parents turned in their children's candy to the police in fear that they were laced with something. Timothy's story was not adding up. It was discovered that he had recently bought large life insurance policies on the kids that his wife knew nothing about. His plan was to kill both his children and collect the insurance money. He also wanted to kill the other 3 kids simply so it wouldn't look like a random trick-or-treat incident, deflecting suspicion away from him. When you start talking about Halloween pranks, most people immediately think of egging. Well, like clockwork, every 2 or 3 years someone is killed over an egg-throwing prank, and not always the person you may think. Such is the case of Carl Jackson. He was driving his girlfriend and her son home from a kid's Halloween party when he heard an egg splat against the side of his car. Jackson saw the group of young men responsible and, being in the Bronx, had a few choice words to say. The kind of words that a little boy in the back seat probably shouldn't repeat. One of the men took offense to being so admonished and followed them. When Jackson stopped at the next traffic light, he was shot in the head and killed. Our final Halloween tale of murder and mayhem comes from Bellhaven, Connecticut in 1975. 15-year-old Martha Moxley left the house that night intent on joining some neighborhood kids in some good old-fashioned Halloween pranks. They called it Mischief Night, and they planned to roll a few houses in toilet paper and ring a few doorbells. She ran across the street to Michael and Thomas Skakel's house, where the rest of the kids were waiting. She wouldn't make it back home. She was found the next morning, half naked, under a tree in her backyard. She had been viciously beaten with a 6-iron golf club. The Skakel brothers immediately came under suspicion. Thomas was the last to be seen with her, and the golf club came from the Skakel's garage. Martha had been beaten so severely that the club had broken into 3 pieces, and still her killer beat her and stabbed her several times with the shaft. The excessive nature of the attack led police to believe that Martha knew her assailant and that the crime had been committed in anger. Witnesses claimed that Martha had been flirting all night with Thomas and that Michael hadn't been very happy about it. The last time she was seen, her and Thomas fell behind the fence together, kissing. The Skakels would be given preferential treatment during the entire span of the investigation. The police announced that they believed Martha's death was a random killing and that they suspected a hitchhiker who had been passing through the area, all of which greatly contradicted the evidence on hand. No one would be charged and held responsible for Martha's death for over 25 years. And why not? How did the Skakels not become the number one suspects? Well, their cousin was Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. To say that the Skakel children grew up rich and spoiled, and perhaps entitled, would be an understatement. Besides the influence of the Kennedy name, Michael's father controlled the largest and wealthiest privately held corporations in the world. According to the neighbors, Michael and his siblings were given unlimited funds and zero supervision, especially after their mother died a few years before. Michael never did very well in school. He struggled with dyslexia and coped by being the school troublemaker and bully. He either flunked out or was kicked out of a dozen different schools. It got worse after his mother's death. Despite being just 13, Michael began drinking heavily. By the time he was 15, the night Martha died, he was a violent alcoholic, just like his dad. And that's according to RFK Jr. himself. In 1978, Skakel was arrested for drunk driving when he was just 18 years old. In order to get the charges dropped, his father arranged for him to attend a private boarding school that was really a rehab center for the ultra-rich, spoiled teens. But it would take another decade and several more rehab facilities before Michael ever got clean. Martha's murder regained national attention in the 90s, with several books being written about it. The case has also been featured in several television crime shows, with most every one of them citing the overwhelming evidence against Michael Skakel. Finally, in 2002, 27 years after Martha's death, Michael was charged and taken to trial. Both his and Thomas's alibis and stories have changed over the years, because explaining to investigators that their DNA may be present at the scene because they had both, at different times through the night, and without knowledge of each other, by pure coincidence, masturbated under the very tree where Martha had been found. During the trial, a man named Gregory Coleman came forward who knew Michael from that private boarding school. Coleman said that Michael confessed to killing the girl and bragged about having gotten away with murder. Skakel was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. But in 2013, was granted a retrial and released on bail. He would never spend another night in prison. That trial never took place. In 2016, the Connecticut Supreme Court reinstated his conviction, but he was not taken into custody. Then, RFK Jr. weighed in with his thoughts and influence. He wrote a book titled Framed, claiming Michael's innocence. In 2018, the same state Supreme Court ordered a new trial, but that didn't happen either. 45 years to the day that Martha died, Halloween 2020, the Connecticut State Attorney declared that Skakel would not be retried. Case closed. Happy Halloween. To learn more about these stories, check out horrorhistory.net, grunge.com, history.com, NBCchicago.com, smithsonianmag.com, and theatlantic.com. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. It was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything Jeff's up to at adarkerworld.com. You can find everything that we're up to at wreakhavocproductions.com. Special thanks to Chad Hunt for lending his vocal talents to this episode. You can find the Carolina Haints podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or you can listen directly from the link at carolinahaints.libsyn.com. Be sure to pick up your copy of the Carolina Haints book in your local bookstores today. It's packed full of great North Carolina ghosts and legends, and just in time for Halloween. To learn more about Carolina Haints, be sure to like the official Facebook page at facebook.com/Carolina Haints. I'm on Instagram at Wreak Havoc Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. You can also find more about us at our website, carolinahaints.com. Be sure to click on the appearances page to find all of our upcoming public appearances. As always, you can email me at carolinahaints@gmail.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about those things that go bump in the night.